This is my second segment on a question that I was asked about the juxtaposition of the Rambam's idea that the purpose of creation serves the purpose of creation is not just people but other entities as well, versus Chassidus' idea that the purpose of creation is dir b'tachtenim, where it's all about people. In your English words, anthropocentric worldview. So I want to continue what I started in the first segment, and I want to develop it a little bit further. Before I approach what the Rambam holds, let's first establish a constant, and that is that the Rambam is a philosopher. Now we hold, Chassidus hold, that the Rambam was actually a great mystic. It says in Sefer HaSichos Tovshin in page 41, the previous Rebbe says in the name of the Baal Shem Tov that the Rambam was a big Makubal. But his writings are according to the laws of philosophy, meaning that Rambam may have alluded to and may have written into the fabric of his thoughts Kabbalah behind the philosophy, but on the surface he writes like a philosopher. And philosophers and mystics have a foundational disagreement. And the difference would be this. According to the philosophers, logic is truth. And according to the mystics, logic is a created truth. In other words, according to philosophy, if something doesn't make sense, it's stupid. It's wrong. It's not just stupid and wrong for me and you, it's stupid and wrong for anybody. Because if something is illogical, it's false. If you think about that a little bit more deeply, that means that they're binding God to the laws of logic, or to say it in a deeper level, that God is logic on the level of essence, or in the classic Hebrew quote, the philosophers hold that something which is not logical is not true. Kabbalah disagrees. Kabbalah has this idea, which is based on the Shal Tshuvas Harash B'Siman Taf Yud Ches, which is quoted in Chassidus. You have it by the Tzemach Tzedek a little bit, by the Rebbe Rashabalat some more, and by the Rebbe on Ashir, this idea called Nimna Nimnois. Nimna Nimnois means that logic is a creation. And the creator of logic isn't bound by its laws. And therefore, in Chassidus, logic is not the be-all and end-all. Hashem can do things that don't make sense, because he's not bound by the laws of logic, unless he encapsulates himself, he frames himself to operate within the laws of logic, so we should be able to relate to him, in which case his relationship with us is logical. And of course, so much of what Chassidus does is explain that the Eibishter created the world according to the blueprint of the Torah, and the Torah is logical, because Hashem wants us to understand. But that the truth of the matter is that ultimately there's a place where those laws of logic stop, and Hashem isn't bound by the laws of logic, while the Rambam holds that he is. One of the consequences of this debate is the following question. If you or I wanted to discuss what is the loftiest, what is the highest idea in the reality, what's the greatest thing a human being could achieve, in the language of the Rambam, that would be Yedias Hashem, to know God. And that's what the Rambam writes in the beginning of the Rambam, at the end of the Rambam, at the end of Hilchos Tshuva, that the purpose of creation is to come to know God. The purpose of creation is to do mitzvahs on a level where the Taimei mitzvahs are l'das Hashem, to know God. And the word know means to know intellectually. Obviously, to know intellectually better than you and I know now. But ultimately, in the language and the world view of the Rambam, the highest idea is l'das Hashem b'lvad, to know God alone. Chassidus doesn't use the language knowledge of God, even though there is such a concept, a very important concept in Chassidus that speaks to that idea. Chassidus speaks to Gili of Ein Seif, Gili of Elokus, because Ein Seif is much more than logic. It's beyond logic. It's Ein Seif. The Rambam doesn't speak of the Ein Seif. He doesn't speak of godliness, because at least in the way he writes in his Sfarim, in quotes, he doesn't hold of it, end quote, because within the parameters of philosophy there isn't anything above logic. So the Rambam speaks as the greatest thing is being logic, and logic associated with the ultimate truth of logic, which is the creator. And Chassidus speaks about knowing godliness, which creates a huge disparity between the Rambam and Chassidus and Kabbalah. And from the times of the Rambam, for a very long time, people who were associated with Kabbalah would attack the Rambam, had huge issues with the Rambam, based on this quote-unquote limitation, where the Rambam seems to be limiting his definition of God and limiting his definition of the purpose to logic. one of the most important Sfarim that's extremely critical of the Rambam is the same Sefer Avodas HaKodesh that I mentioned in my earlier segment about the idea of Avodah Tzarech Kavaya. In every section and in every occasion, the Avodas HaKodesh, who wrote what is really one of the most important books of Kabbalah ever written, because he doesn't just tell you what Kabbalah is, he tells you what Kabbalah is for. If I said this to you before, if I was translating a book of Kabbalah into English, it wouldn't be Kisvei Arizal, it wouldn't be the Pardes, it would be the Avodas HaKodesh. Because Avodas HaKodesh is actually not just the what of Kabbalah, but the why of Kabbalah. He explains to you what Kabbalah changes in our religious life, in our personal relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And he attacks the Rambam on every occasion, because the Rambam is logical and a philosopher, and the Avodas HaKodesh, Rabbi Ben Gabi, is a mystic, and he points out, quote unquote, the limitations in the Rambam's logic based on the so-called limitations that are imposed on him by philosophy. But the next generation after the Avodas HaKodesh is the Ramak, Ramesha Kudaviru, who lived in Sfas. He was originally from Spain, he lived in Sfas at the end of his life. The Mechaber Avodas HaKodesh, Rabbi Ben Gabi, I think was from the Yerushi, Portugal. He was from the Jews expelled from Portugal. The Ramak came from Cordova, but he was not born in Cordova because he was born after the expulsion. The Ramak is the first Makubal who finds it important to try to find a synthesis, a unity between the Rambam and Kabbalah. As you see in the footnote in Tanya chapter 2, and then it says, beginning with the Ramak, there's been an effort by the great Kabbalists, which is close to 500 years old, to stop criticizing the Rambam for disagreeing with Kabbalah and find ways of synthesizing the two bodies of knowledge. This is discussed in some detail in Derech Mitzvah Amanos Elokus, chapters 3 and 4, which you may be familiar with, where the Tzemach Tzedek brings the Maral MiPrague. Maral MiPrague, like the Avodas HaKodesh, attacks the Rambam based on the supposition that you can either be a philosopher or a mystic, you can't be both, and the Maral as a mystic is disagreeing with the Rambam. The Tzemach Tzedek brings this disagreement, and the whole purpose of bringing this disagreement is to argue that there's a way of synthesizing, of creating a unity between what the Rambam says and what Kabbalah says. And in the words of the Tanya, it's in Atzilus we agree with the Ramban, but not hard in Atzilus. In Atzilus, the Rambam's concept of Hashem, which is who I do and Amada, is consistent with Kabbalah's concept of Chochmah, of Atzilus, of Sfiris, of Midas, but not hard in Atzilus. The Rebbe spoke about this often, and the Rebbe went out of his way. He bent himself inside out to synthesize, to create unity, to create harmony between the Rambam and Kabbalah. In my view, the final word on this subject is the second Hadron of the Rebbe, which the Rebbe said in 1986. The date was Chavvov Adar Rishon, which was the end of the second cycle, so that the beginning of the third cycle was Chav Zayin Adar Aleph Tov Shin Mem Vav, which was one of those precisenesses of dates that gives you goose pimples. And in that Hadrin, the Rebbe explains that the Rambam is right, logic is right, after the Tzimtzum, and above logic, Nimna Noise is right, before the Tzimtzum. So the Rebbe is going much higher. We don't say only that Chassidus agrees with the Rambam till Atzilus. We said that Kabbalah and Chassidus could work with the Rambam till Tzimtzum Rishon, but not higher. So this is important to know, that it was very important to our Rabbeim to not disagree with the Rambam and to find a way of creating harmony between what the Rambam says and what we say. I'm going to leave the final point, which is really the answer to your question, to my third segment.